Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today we are talking about Diamonds Are Forever. Not the 1971 film adaptation, but we're going back to the source, the original novel on which the 1971 film is loosely based, published in 1956. What you find in the Fleming original isn't what you find in the 1971 film adaptation. There's no diamond-encrusted laser satellite or Ernst Stavro Blofeld. What you get instead is a darker, subtler crime story in which Bond traverses the American continent in search of a diamond smuggling ring. It's got romance, it's got mobsters, it's got a ghost town in the middle of the Old West. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite come together despite having one of Ian Fleming's best love stories. Bond girl Tiffany Case is a real character, not a cliche. She is Ian Fleming's first fully fledged female creation. She is every bit a match for James Bond and provides the most satisfying love story in the books yet. And in fact, Bond's romance with Tiffany Case is even more satisfying than his romance with Vesper Lynd in Ian Fleming's Casino Royale, or his romance with Tracy in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. If you've only seen the film adaptation, that might come as quite a surprise, given that Tiffany Case in the film novel is not exactly a character of depth, but here, she's really quite remarkable, and she is really the reason to read Ian Fleming's Diamonds Are Forever. As great as Tiffany Case is, the Spang brothers, the mobsters who are the villains of Ian Fleming's Diamonds Are Forever, are the worst villains that Ian Fleming ever conceived. They're a forgettable, mostly absent villainous force. They are operating a mob machine from behind the scenes, and despite some vague attempts to make them interesting, one of the brothers is obsessed with an Old West ghost town that he's refurbished and turned into a base of his operations. They're not really that interesting, and their organization isn't really that interesting. All the hoodlums that populate the Spang brothers' enterprise are mostly forgettable, generic mobster cliches that fail to provide a satisfying counterpoint to James Bond. That old western ghost town, named Spectreville, is actually one of the story's most exciting elements. Diamonds Are Forever is a bit of a slog, but it picks up in its final third when Bond arrives at Spectreville. It's a strange sequence, and that's actually its strong point. It's so memorable to have Bond isolated in the middle of the Nevada desert, Bond being thrust into the middle of something that is so uniquely American and so strange as a villain dressing up as a cowboy and playing on his own restored luxury locomotive adds a level of fantasy and color to an otherwise rather sedate book. It's the kind of set piece that actually might have worked well in the 1971 film, given that the Western had recently seen a revival with the spaghetti Western, the films that launched Clint Eastwood into superstardom. It would have been interesting to see Sean Connery as James Bond trapped in a ghost town in the Old West and having to navigate his way out of it. But despite its leaps into fancy, the Diamonds Are Forever novel is actually rooted in the tradition of hard-boiled fiction. That is, hard-boiled fiction is the detective story that gave birth to the film noir genre, and you really feel Ian Fleming trying to pay tribute to the legacy of authors such as Hammett and Chandler and the way that he describes Bond's pursuit of these smugglers across the United States. Unfortunately, that hard-boiled tone doesn't quite click. Ian Fleming is so invested in his usual appetite for travelogue that something gets lost in the mix. There's just a bit too much dry description of the American milieu, which might have been more interest to Ian Fleming than to me as an American reader. The way Fleming describes the American continent is often a little bit too academic, even though Fleming has a very sharp critique of American culture and doesn't hesitate to let Bond show his disdain for the Americanization of the world. But the biggest problem with this novel is just that the middle loses its way. It starts well enough with a very striking passage with a scorpion in the desert. It's one of the few elements the film adaptation actually carried forward, but then devolves into a fairly meandering adventure as Bond and Felix Leiter go to Saratoga Springs to watch a horse race. Whenever Tiffany Case appears, the novel comes alive, but she's absent for too much of the adventure. Felix Leiter would be a welcome presence, but he's barely here as an actual character. He's just a cardboard sidekick in this novel, despite his rich history with Bond, and so there's not much joy to be had in his interactions with 007 here. There's a good book in Diamonds Are Forever, but it just keeps losing its way somehow. It's less of a spy thriller than a moody road novel, with side quests, soft glamour, and the growing sense that Bond doesn't really belong in North America. Fleming's vision of America is loosely hallucinatory. Every space feels artificial and vaguely threatening. In that tension, you really get to feel Ian Fleming's ambivalence about America. If anything, Diamonds Are Forever is the novel in which Bond confronts the American project the most directly. The movie abandoned this premise pretty heavily, and you can't blame them entirely because the novel is pretty sluggish. There's not a lot to work with if you're trying to create a spectacular bit of film entertainment. If anything, this is a relatively intimate crime story by the standard of the Bond films. What they keep are broad details. There are killers named Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd. There's a Las Vegas setting, and there's a lead Bond girl named Tiffany Case. But the details are all rather different. The film introduces Blofeld as a villain instead of the Spang brothers and gives him an alter ego in this Willard White persona that he's adopted in order to take over an industrial enterprise in the American continent and build a laser satellite. This is all much more outlandish than anything Ian Fleming attempted, and it ultimately fails to capture the venom that Ian Fleming has for so much of the crass American culture. There's certainly a bit of Bond being a fish out of water in the 1971 film, but there's less of Bond's ambivalence towards American culture. And perhaps the greatest tragedy in transferring this novel into a film adaptation is the loss of one of Ian Fleming's great love stories. Tiffany Case is a girl with a traumatic backstory that has made the best of her life that she can by working with criminal elements, becoming a car dealer, entering into the world of diamond smuggling. When she meets Bond, she finds a way out and actually starts to force Bond to think seriously about what it would be like to be married, to have kids. In the novels, this is really the moment where Bond starts to seriously think about what it would be like to be in a long-term relationship. And in fact, we find out in subsequent books that Bond and Tiffany actually lived together for many years after the course of this. This is the start of a long-term relationship for James Bond. In fact, his relationship with Tiffany Case in the novels is his most stable relationship. And their chemistry here is palpable. Ian Fleming really creates something lovely in Tiffany Case, in part because she's so feisty, so strong, and she keeps Bond on his toes. She's not afraid to challenge him, to question him. When they are engaging in their courtship together, Bond is clear about what he's looking for in a relationship, that he's not really looking to settle down. Tiffany doesn't hesitate to critique him, to roast him. It's that kind of back and forth that is so exciting in Bond's relationships, where Tiffany is really able to keep Bond on his toes. But there's also a deep sentimental romance between the two of them. There's this section when they're on the Queen Elizabeth at the end, and they're having dinner together, and Bond comments that his ideal woman would know how to make sauce béarnaise. And Bond goes back to his room, and then suddenly he's met at the door by a porter carrying a steak covered in sauce béarnaise with a bottle of champagne, and there's a card on it from the chef that says, "This sauce béarnaise was made by Tiffany Case with no assistance from myself." It's such a lovely gesture of courtship that shows that Tiffany is as invested in this relationship as Bond might be, and you get the sense that they're both in it together, which raises the stakes at the very end when Winton kid, who are very different in the novel than they are in the film adaptation, show up to threaten Tiffany Case's life, and Bond has to resort to violence to rescue them both and secure their future together. It's understandable, coming on the heels of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, why the filmmakers would have been reluctant to explore yet another heavy-duty romantic relationship right after the relationship with Tracy in the prior film. But the disservice they do to Tiffany Case, who has such a keen sense of intelligence, such a strong sense of independence and her own survival. Tiffany Case in the 1971 film starts off interestingly. She's a cartoonish figure, but at least she keeps Bond on his toes, but she quickly evolves into a broad joke. And it's unfortunate that one of Fleming's greatest romances has never really been properly adapted. Maybe that's something we can hope for in the films to come. In fact, many of the great Fleming romances are yet to be adapted. Fleming's Bond is a character who is continually falling in love over and over again in the books, and his relationships with women are significantly more complex and interesting than their versions are on screen. The same problem occurs with Domino, and we'll certainly talk about that when we get to a Thunderball review. There's also something lost in the way Ian Fleming's novel has some darker, harsher aspects. Bond is really put through the ringer in this novel, as he is in most of the Fleming novels. He's brutally beaten and nearly wrecked by the end. Tiffany Case is the one who really has to save Bond when he's broken and beaten down in the Spectreville section. She's the one who helps him escape off of the restored locomotive that they're both trapped on and helps him get to safety. This sense in which Bond really has to sacrifice over the course of this story is something that I wish the films had indulged in more often. It's always satisfying to see a beloved hero get put through the ringer. It's the John McClane effect, so to speak. We love to see our heroes tortured and then overcome. I'm not too broken up about other aspects of this novel being abandoned. This section at Saratoga Springs is pretty dry and not particularly cinematic. Even the events in Vegas aren't particularly thrilling in many ways. The film comes up with more colorful ways to use the Vegas of 1971 than Fleming was able to use the Vegas of the 1950s. But something's still lost in the sense that the 1971 film doesn't know how to make Vegas a particularly threatening place, and Fleming's version of Vegas does feel ominous and a little chilling. And there is something interesting in the idea of putting Bond against the mob. Let's say if we were to envision James Bond in the Martin Scorsese film Casino, and the way that Bond might exist in such a violent, exuberant, decadent world. That's an interesting angle, and unfortunately, the 1971 film doesn't really lean into that. That said, Ian Fleming himself didn't really exploit that angle to its fullest extent. So, as I wrap things up here, I want to ask you, have you read this book? Is this book one of your favorites? I've been asking folks on Instagram how they feel about this novel, and I've gotten comments all over the map. I think this novel has some very fine aspects that draw me back to the book time and time again, but I have to say overall, it's perhaps my least favorite Ian Fleming novel, and thus I can't recommend it too strongly. So I think every Bond fan should read Diamonds Are Forever at least once in order to experience some of Fleming's best romantic writing. If you want to know more about my thoughts about the 1971 film adaptation, feel free to watch my video on the film. I'll link that in the description below. And otherwise, I look forward to chatting with you all in the comments. I'll catch you in the next one.